Snow was falling over Ashcombe Hall the night Margaret Whitmore first heard the coughing through the nursery wall, a sound so raw it seemed to scrape the plaster itself. She had been hired 3 days prior, summoned by an agency letter that gave her little more than an address and a warning: the lady of the house is dying, and the household is in disarray. No one had mentioned the young man who sat outside the sickroom door each evening, coat patched at the elbows, boots worn thin at the heel, watching the hallway as though he expected it to collapse. "You're new," he said the first night, not looking up from the small fire he was tending in the hall grate himself, like a servant who couldn't afford to summon one. The others didn't last a week. "I don't intend to be the others," Margaret said. He looked at her then, a long, searching look, as if trying to read something written beneath her skin, and said nothing more. She did not know his name. The housekeeper called him only Mr. Ashford, said with a strange caution, as though the words themselves might break something. Margaret assumed him a distant relation, some poor cousin taken in out of duty, given a room in the servants' wing and a mother to watch die. She did not know that the man feeding the fire with his own hands was the Duke of Ashford, nor that 3 women before her had been turned away the moment they'd learned who truly owned the house, their devotion evaporating into calculation the instant a title entered the room. He had stopped trusting anyone who looked at him and saw a fortune. He meant to find out, once and for all, whether anyone could look at nothing, and choose to stay. What he didn't expect was that watching her sit through the night beside his mother's bed, humming some half-remembered lullaby to ease the old woman's breathing, would undo him more thoroughly than any ledger of debts ever could. The Dowager Duchess had been ill for the better part of a year, though the physicians could no longer agree on precisely what ailed her: a weakness of the lungs, they said, worsened by grief and the Yorkshire damp. Margaret had nursed enough dying women to know that some illnesses had less to do with the body than with a heart that had simply grown tired of beating against loneliness. "You hum," the old woman said one evening, her voice thin as paper. "My son used to hum, when he was small. Before he learned that dukes aren't meant to." Margaret smiled and smoothed the coverlet. "I didn't know you had a son living, Your Grace. The house feels so quiet, I assumed." "Everyone assumes." The Duchess's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the dark shape of the grounds beyond. "He is closer than you think." Margaret thought little of the remark. The house was full of half-finished sentences and doors that stayed shut. She had learned not to press. Instead she busied herself with the routines that had become her private comfort: the folding of linens, the steeping of chamomile, the low conversations with Mr. Ashford in the corridor each night when he brought up wood for the fire himself rather than ring for a footman. He was an odd sort of poor relation, she thought. He read Latin. He spoke to the old groundskeeper with the easy familiarity of someone who had known him for decades, not weeks. He flinched, faintly, whenever anyone addressed him too formally, as though the words sat wrong on him. "You needn't carry the wood yourself," she told him one night, finding him stacking logs by the hearth, sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. "Surely there's a servant for it." "I'd rather do it," he said. "It's the one thing in this house I can still control." There was something in the way he said it, not bitterness exactly, but a kind of exhaustion she recognized from her own life, from years of being useful to people who never once asked how she was managing. She sat down across from him without quite deciding to. "Tell me about her," she said. "Your aunt, cousin, whatever she is to you." "My mother," he said quietly, and something flickered across his face before he caught it. "She raised me to believe that duty was the only love worth trusting. I think it broke something in both of us." Margaret didn't press further, though she noted the slip, "my mother," and filed it away without understanding its weight. She only knew that the man across from her spoke of duty and love as though they were opposing forces, and that beneath his threadbare coat was a kind of grief she hadn't expected to find in a house this grand. Over the following days, a rhythm formed between them. He would arrive after the physician's evening visit, ask after his mother's breathing with a carefulness that seemed excessive for a mere relation, and stay long past when propriety required. Margaret found herself watching for his step on the stair, found herself saving small observations to tell him that the Duchess had eaten a full bowl of broth, that her color had come back for an hour in the afternoon light. She did not tell him what she had begun to feel, because she did not yet have a name for it, and because Clara, her oldest friend, brought on as an under-housekeeper the same week Margaret arrived, had already begun to eye the arrangement with open suspicion. "He's not what he says he is," Clara murmured one evening, catching Margaret's sleeve in the linen closet. "A poor cousin doesn't get his correspondence delivered by riders in Ashford livery." "I've seen the seal, Margaret. Ducal seal." "You're imagining things," Margaret said, though a small unease had begun to settle low in her stomach. "He hasn't a penny to his name." "You've seen his coat." "I've seen a great many things that don't add up," Clara said. "And I don't like being made a fool of in a house that isn't ours." Margaret brushed it off that night, telling herself Clara's instincts, usually so reliable, had simply gone astray this once. But she found herself watching him differently after that, the straightness of his back when he thought no one was looking, the way the old groundskeeper touched his cap to him before catching himself, the strange reverence in the housekeeper's voice whenever she said his name. Something in the house was not what it seemed. And somewhere beyond its walls, in a solicitor's office in Leeds, Lord Pembroke was already drafting the papers that would declare the Duke of Ashford unfit, absent, and no longer master of anything at all. By the second week of December, the unease Clara had planted refused to leave Margaret alone. She told herself it was foolish, that a man who split his own firewood and wore a coat gone thin at the cuffs could hardly be the master of an estate this size, but small details kept surfacing, each one a splinter she couldn't quite work free. There was the matter of the study. Margaret had gone looking for ink one afternoon, the Duchess wanting to dictate a letter, and had wandered into a room she'd never been permitted before, a vast library with a desk the size of a small boat, ledgers stacked in neat towers, and above the mantel, a portrait so large it seemed to watch the whole room. She stopped cold in front of it. The man in the painting wore fine blue superfine and a signet ring, his chin lifted with the particular confidence of someone born knowing his place in the world. But the face was unmistakably the same one that had sat beside her in the corridor 3 nights running, feeding a fire he had no need to feed. "His late Grace," said a voice behind her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, had appeared in the doorway, a stack of linens in her arms and an expression carefully arranged into blankness. "The old Duke. Passed some years back. He looks so like," Margaret began. "A family resemblance," Mrs. Fenwick said quickly, too quickly, and ushered her out with the ink before Margaret could finish the thought. That night, Margaret sat with the Duchess longer than usual, watching the old woman's chest rise and fall with a shallowness that frightened her more each day. When the Duchess woke near midnight, disoriented and reaching for someone who wasn't there, she gripped Margaret's wrist with surprising strength. "Edmund," she whispered. "Is that you? Have you come to sit with me?" "It's Margaret, your Grace. Your nurse." The Duchess's eyes cleared slowly, focusing on her face with something like relief, and then something like guilt. "Of course. Forgive me. My son visits so quietly these days I sometimes mistake the hour." "Edmund," Margaret repeated softly. "Is that Mr. Ashford's given name?" The Duchess's hand went still on the coverlet. For a long moment she said nothing, and Margaret watched something pass behind the old woman's eyes, calculation, or perhaps regret. "You care for him," the Duchess said finally. It was not a question. "I hardly know him," Margaret said, though the words felt thinner than she meant them to be. "No," the Duchess agreed. "But you will. And when you do, I hope you'll remember that whatever he's done, he did it because the alternative frightened him more than losing everything." She closed her eyes before Margaret could ask what she meant, and sleep, or something that looked like it, claimed her again. Margaret sat awake long after, turning the name over in her mind. Edmund. She thought of the portrait, the ducal seal Clara had described, the way the old groundskeeper's cap came halfway off his head before he caught himself. Separately, each detail was nothing. Together, they formed a shape she didn't want to look at directly, because looking at it meant admitting how thoroughly she had been managed, watched, tested, weighed, without her knowledge or consent. She found him in the corridor near dawn, as she always did, the fire already lit, his sleeves already rolled. This time she didn't sit. "Your mother called you Edmund last night," she said. Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for a blow and finally feels it land. "Margaret." "Don't," she said, quieter than she intended. "Just tell me who you are. All of it. I've been made a fool of enough this week without adding my own silence to the pile." He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Margaret felt the whole shape of the last 2 weeks rearranging itself, every kindness, every late-night conversation, every small grief he'd shared, all of it recast in a light she hadn't asked for and didn't yet know how to bear. Outside, in Leeds, a solicitor named Griggs was already sealing an envelope addressed to the county magistrate, its contents drafted at Lord Pembroke's instruction, a petition declaring the Duke of Ashford missing, unfit, and his estate in need of immediate, guardianship-appointed management. Pembroke had timed it well. Within the week, if no one intervened, the signature at the bottom of that petition would matter more than any name spoken in a servant's corridor at dawn. "My name is Edmund Ashford," he said finally, and the syllables seemed to cost him something physical, as though he'd been holding his breath around them for weeks. "Duke of Ashford. I own this house. I own the land for 6 miles in every direction. And I have been lying to you since the night we met." Margaret said nothing. She found she couldn't, her mind was too busy reassembling every conversation they'd had, searching each one for the lie she should have caught. "3 women came before you," he went on, quieter now, as though speaking too loudly might shatter whatever remained of the moment. "Each one hired to care for my mother. Each one gone within a fortnight, the instant they discovered what I was worth. One asked Mrs. Fenwick, outright, what settlement she might expect if she managed to secure my affections along with my mother's health. I couldn't." He stopped, pressed his knuckles briefly to his mouth. "I couldn't watch it happen a 4th time. So I stopped being the Duke. I let the household believe I was a poor relation taken in on charity, and I watched to see who would stay for my mother's sake alone. And I was your experiment," Margaret said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Something to be tested and measured. You were never that to me," he said, and the rawness in his voice startled her. "Not after the first week. I told myself I was still watching, still weighing, but Margaret, I stopped needing proof of anything the night you sat up humming to my mother when you thought no one else was awake to hear it. I kept the lie going because I was a coward, not because I still doubted you. That was the moment everything changed, not with anger, though anger was there too, hot and close beneath her ribs, but with the sudden, dizzying understanding that the ground she'd been standing on for 2 weeks had never been what she thought it was. The poor man who split his own firewood. The gentle voice in the corridor. The grief he'd worn so openly it had felt like the truest thing about him. All of it real, and all of it staged, in a way she couldn't yet make peace with. "Your mother knew," she said. "She called for Edmund and you weren't even in the room, and she looked at me like she pitied me. She begged me to stop this months ago." He passed a hand over his face. "I didn't listen. I was so afraid of being loved for the title that I nearly missed being loved at all." Margaret turned toward the window, toward the grey Yorkshire morning gathering itself over the grounds, and tried to find her footing in a conversation that had appended everything she thought she understood about the last 2 weeks of her life. She thought of Clara's warnings, brushed aside. She thought of the portrait, the seal, the groundskeeper's half-bow. She thought, too, of the way he'd looked at her in the corridor each night, not like a duke assessing a prospect, but like a man starving for something he didn't believe he deserved. "I need time," she said finally. "I can't simply, Edmund, I don't even know which parts of you I've been sitting with these past 2 weeks. All of them," he said quietly. "That's the one thing I never lied about." She left him standing by the fire and went to check on the Duchess, her thoughts in ragged pieces, and it was there, in the old woman's room, searching for a shawl in the writing desk drawer, that she found the letter that would matter far more than anything Edmund had confessed that morning, a folded note in an unfamiliar hand, addressed to the Duchess, warning her that her nephew Pembroke had engaged a solicitor in Leeds and meant to have the estate declared without a legitimate master. Within the fortnight, meant, in fact, to have papers drawn up suggesting the Duke himself had abandoned his post and could not be found. Margaret read it twice, her pulse rising, and understood all at once that the danger to this house was no longer a matter of secrets between two people in a corridor. It was already outside the walls, already moving toward them, and it would not wait for her to make peace with a lie before it arrived. She brought the letter to him within the hour, her anger at his deception folded away for the moment beneath something more urgent. He read it twice by the window, his jaw tightening with each line, and when he looked up, the last traces of the humble steward's son were gone from his face entirely. "Pembroke has wanted this house since we were boys," he said. "He used to say I only held the title because I was born 11 months before him. I never thought he'd go so far as forged petitions." "Forged?" Margaret asked. "You're certain?" "I never abandoned my post. I've been 30 feet from this room every night for 2 months. A humorless laugh escaped him. "Though I suppose I've made his case rather easy, haven't I, hiding in my own house, letting the county believe whatever it likes." Margaret felt the weight of that settle on her, too. Her silence, her distance since his confession, had bought Pembroke time he might not otherwise have had. She pushed the thought aside, there would be room later to untangle her own feelings from the danger now bearing down on the house. "Then we stop pretending," she said. "You go to Leeds. You show them your face, your seal, whatever proof a duke carries to prove he's a duke. Today. It isn't so simple. Griggs is Pembroke's man through and through, he'll delay, claim the papers need verifying, drag it out long enough for the magistrate's ruling to stand regardless of what I say. Pembroke hasn't survived this long by being careless." Edmund pressed the letter flat against the desk, staring at it as though it might rearrange itself into something less dangerous. "And there's my mother. If I leave for Leeds and she takes a turn while I'm gone." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. That evening the Dowager Duchess grew worse. Her breathing turned shallow and quick, her skin cooled to the touch despite the fire built high in the grate, and the physician, summoned at midnight through driving sleet, would say only that the next 2 days would tell which way things went. Margaret sat with her through the dark hours, pressing cool cloths to her brow, while down the corridor Edmund paced outside the door he could not bring himself to enter, unable to watch and unable to stay away. "You should sleep," Margaret told him near dawn, finding him still there, still in his patched coat, as though he hadn't yet allowed himself to become the Duke again even now. "I can't lose her while pretending to be someone else," he said. "I've spent 2 months being a man with nothing to offer her but company. I find I don't want to stop now, whatever else happens." Something in Margaret softened despite herself, not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition that the man beside her was not performing grief for her benefit. There was no one left to perform for. Pembroke's petition would move forward with or without an audience, the Duchess would live or fail to live regardless of who witnessed it. "I read something in your mother's face, the night she called for you," Margaret said quietly. "She wasn't confused when she said your name. She knew exactly who I was and exactly who you weren't telling me you were. I think she's been waiting for you to stop hiding longer than you realize." Edmund said nothing, but his hand found the doorframe as though he needed something solid to hold. By midday, word arrived that shattered whatever fragile ground remained, a rider from Leeds, breathless, bearing news that the magistrate had reviewed Pembroke's petition and found the documentation, however troubling, procedurally sound enough to warrant a formal hearing, set for 3 days hence. If the Duke could not appear and satisfactorily account for his prolonged absence from public life, guardianship of the estate, and every decision concerning it, would pass to Lord Pembroke pending further review. 3 days. A dying mother who might not survive the week. A household already unraveling under the weight of secrets. And Margaret, standing in the center of it all, still uncertain whether the man she'd begun to love was the poor steward's son who'd fed the fire with his own hands, or the Duke who'd let her believe a lie for the sake of his own wounded heart. The Duchess did not improve. By the second night, Her breathing had grown so faint that Margaret barely left her side, and Edmund, no longer bothering with the fiction of Mr. Ashford, dressed now in clothes that fit the man he actually was, sat on the other side of the bed, holding his mother's hand as though he could keep her tethered to the world through sheer refusal to let go. "I should be in Leeds," he said hoarsely, "somewhere past midnight. Preparing. Griggs will twist every silence I've kept these 2 months into proof I'm unfit to hold the title at all." "You should be here," Margaret said. "She needs you more than a hearing room does. And if she dies while I'm proving myself worthy of a house she may not live to see me keep." His voice cracked on the question, and for the first time since she'd known him, since the very first night by the fire, Margaret saw him entirely undone, stripped of every title and every disguise, nothing left but a man terrified of losing his mother while the world outside conspired to take everything else from him too. Clara arrived the next morning with news that made the hopelessness complete. She'd gone into the village for salt and bandages and returned pale, her basket forgotten at the door. "Pembroke's in Ashcombe village," she said. "He's brought Griggs with him, and half the county's talking already, that the Duke's gone mad hiding in his own servant's wing, that the estate wants a steadier hand. Margaret, they're saying it like it's already decided. People believe what's said loudest, not what's true." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. 3 days had narrowed to 2, and in that time, public opinion, the one thing Edmund could not out-argue with a signet ring, had already begun to turn against him. Worse, the Duchess had woken only twice since dawn, each time more distant than the last, murmuring names that belonged to decades ago, to a husband long dead and a son still small enough to be carried. "I don't know how to save any of it," Edmund admitted that evening, standing at the window where Margaret had first found the portrait's twin 2 weeks before. "Not her. Not the house. Not," he stopped himself, but Margaret understood the shape of the unfinished sentence. "Not us," she finished quietly. He turned. "I wouldn't blame you for walking away from all of it. The lie, the scandal, a hearing that may end with me stripped of everything I have to offer. You came here to nurse a dying woman, not to be dragged into a war for a dukedom." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, at the exhaustion carved into his face, the fear he could no longer hide behind borrowed poverty, and felt the last of her anger finally give way to something steadier. "I didn't come here for a dukedom," she said. "I never wanted one. I wanted to know if the man in that corridor, the one who fed his own fire and sat up with his mother when he thought no one was watching, I wanted to know if he was real." She stepped closer. "He was. Whatever else you've hidden, that much was never a lie, and I won't pretend otherwise just because it's inconvenient to admit." It was, in that moment, the only comfort either of them had, not a solution, not a plan, only the quiet certainty that whatever was about to be lost, it would not be lost in a lie. Outside, the sleet had turned to snow again, burying the road to Leeds under a white that made the coming hearing feel, for a few hours at least, impossibly far away and terrifyingly close all at once. The Duchess did not die that night, nor the next. On the morning of the hearing, she woke clear-eyed for the first time in days, gripped Margaret's hand, and said only, "Go with him. Don't let him face Pembroke wearing someone else's coat." Edmund rode to Leeds in his own name at last, signet ring, ducal seal, and Margaret beside him, having refused to be left behind. Before the magistrate, Griggs's forged documents collapsed within minutes. A groundskeeper, a solicitor's clerk, and Mrs. Fenwick herself testified that the Duke had never once left Ashcombe, only ceased, for a time, to announce himself. Pembroke's petition dissolved into the scandal he tried to create, and it was his own signature, not Edmund's absence, that the magistrate found wanting. Pembroke left the county before nightfall, his ambitions buried under the same forged ink he'd hoped would bury his cousin. The Duchess lived to see her son married that spring, in a ceremony small enough to fit the corridor where it had all begun, no title read aloud, no fortune mentioned, only 2 people who had already proven, long before any hearing, exactly what they were worth to one another. What would you have done in her place?